Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. And so I said I was going to try to do episodes more often. Let's see, it's been 3 days since the last one, so I'm doing better than usual, but I'd like to be even more regular than this. So, we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll do one tomorrow or the next day. So anyway, today I wanted to talk about recent events in and concerning Cuba. So, you may have heard on the news or seen on Twitter that there were protests on the island nation of Cuba recently, anti government protests, and the concerns raised by protesters were mainly centered around economic issues, shortages of certain medical supplies, of food items in the stores, and so forth, and issues of government corruption and so forth. And there are real grievances that some people in Cuba have, just as we do in the United States, and people likely in every country in the world have grievances and against their government. Every government has corruption, and every government has problems of various sorts. At the same time, there's also plenty of evidence to suggest that the majority of the Cuban people still support the government. There were also pro-government demonstrations in Cuba a few days ago that were much larger than the anti-government demonstrations. But what was really interesting and for the most part despicable, was the reaction here in the United States among politicians, among the corporate media, and various other sorts of folks, many of whom have like 0 followers on Twitter and just created their accounts a couple of months ago mysteriously. So anyway, I just wanted to review all that and talk a little bit about the reality in Cuba. And so let's start by just looking at the more insane end of the spectrum of politics and reactions to events in Cuba here in the United States. I'm going to play a little bit of a clip here by Richard Medhurst, who's one of my favorite YouTube commentators, where he shows the mayor of Miami, Florida, just less than 100 miles away from Cuba, basically calling for Cuba to be bombed. So let's listen to this for a bit.
There have been protests happening in Cuba, right? And of course, the rational response from the Americans is what? Oh, let's go bomb it. Yeah, let's just go bomb Cuba, right? Let's just bomb everything we don't like. So I'm going to play you this clip from the Miami mayor, and you can take a listen to what he proposes the United States do with Cuba, right?
And what should be being contemplated right now is a coalition of potential military action in Cuba, similar to what has happened in both administrations, in both Republican and Democrat administrations. In Republican with Bush in Panama, they deposed Noriega, and that country had peaceful democracy for decades. And you had interventions by Democratic presidents, taking out Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's a sovereign country where they took out a terrorist that probably saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and President Clinton in Kosovo, intervening in a humanitarian issue with airstrikes. So there have been many opportunities in the history.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table. And there's a variety of ways the military can do it, but that's something that needs to be discussed and needs to be looked at as a potential option, in addition to a variety of other options that can be discussed.
Yeah. I don't know what that word salad was at the end. He's like, that's like an
started off as a protest for one man. Former President Jacob Zuma. Today it has engulfed the entire country. Business owners are complaining of
we can option and explore, right? Lots of options. He went on afterwards on NBC. Take a look at what they asked him over here, right? Take a look at this.
I want to bring in Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, a Republican. Both his father and mother came to the United States from Cuba as children. Mayor Suarez, good to have you back. Thank you so much for your time this morning. In an interview on another network on Tuesday, you said that the United States military should consider airstrikes against Cuba. Why?
No, what I said in another station was that there were instances where different administrations had, considered military options in different theaters.
Dude, that's literally what you said. Why are you lying?
Yeah, good question, Richard. So that was, there was a similar reaction from many other Republican political officials. Well, let's look at the mainstream Democrat side. What did President Joe Biden have to say? The Cuban people are demanding their freedom from an authoritarian regime. I don't think we've seen anything like this protest in a long, long time. The United States stands firmly with the people of Cuba as we blockade them and cut off needed supplies, making their economy scream, basically. You didn't mention that part. But one thing that was really interesting that happened was the way the media you pretended like other protests or other mass gatherings were the anti-government protests in Cuba. So, a ton of corporate media, including the Financial Times, Fox News, the New York Times, and the Guardian, used a picture of a pro-government rally in Cuba to illustrate their articles on anti-government protests, either claiming or at least implying, and CNN did this too, actually, but I couldn't find the article, that these enormous crowds were anti-government protesters. But in fact, there were somewhere between a few hundred to a few thousand anti-government protesters in Cuba, in various places around the island. But there was a demonstration, or there have been several demonstrations, but there was a demonstration of tens of thousands, probably over 100,000 people in support of the Cuban government. And these various media outlets showed pictures of that. You can see 26th of July right here, the Cuban flag. And, there are many of these. 26th of July was that's the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. And there you see anti-government protesters in Havana on Sunday, celebrating the Cuban Revolution, apparently. There's another one. Okay, same picture. Video emerges of mass protests against communist dictatorship in Cuba. Again, this is a pro-government demonstration. Anti-government protesters gathered at the Maximo Gomez Monument in Havana, Cuba on Sunday. Cubans denounce misery in biggest protests in decades. By Francis Robles, New York Times. Again, just flat out lying. Misrepresenting an anti-government, a pro-government protest as an anti-government protest. Same thing in the Guardian. Looks like they all got their talking points for the same place. Anti-government protesters gather at the Mexican. Okay, that's the same one as earlier. Let's see. And here's an interesting thing that happened. Do you see a similarity between this statement? Something happened to the words there. Let's see if we can fix that. Yeah. Oh, I'm still doing that. But you'll notice the wording here to the extent that you can read it, and the wording here. and here, here, and you could go on with this. There were hundreds of these messages, all saying the same thing, created by accounts with like almost no followers, denouncing the Cuban government and saying, the Cuban dictatorship, as they called it, and saying, we want them gone, no more communism. Also, so I showed you several examples from the U.S. corporate media and British corporate media of pro-government protests, very large pro-government protests being misrepresented as anti-government protests. And there were also photos and videos shared all over social media, events happening in other places, not in Cuba, that were misrepresented as Cuban anti-government protests. So here's one from Egypt, I believe, that's represented as being in malcontents in Havana in this at this moment, I guess is what it says. But that is in Egypt. Okay, here's one that was from Washington, D.C. during the Women's March, misrepresented as being the Cuban anti-government protests. It's pretty easy. To people who wrote this article just went to Google Maps and identified the buildings as being in Washington, D.C. There's the one that was from Egypt in 2011. You can't really get a clear view. Well, let's see what happens if you play the video. They sound very angry, don't they? No, actually, this is a celebration that took place in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And there you can see, from Google Maps, that building there is, in downtown Buenos Aires. A celebration of Argentina's win over Brazil in the Copa America soccer match a few days ago. And this one says Raul Castro fled to Venezuela from Cuba in reaction to the protests. Turns out that that picture was taken in 2015. Okay, so you get the idea. It's just a massive propaganda campaign to misrepresent what was going on. Okay, so what's really happening, though? Oh, another one. This from Newsweek. Is China behind Cuba's protests being censored? How Beijing could be linked. Not only were Cuba's protests not censored, but other protests or even celebrations were misrepresented as being in Cuba. There was a ton of coverage of the actual Cuban protests, anti-government protests as well. Very little of the pro-government protests that actually accurately represented them as such. Well, what's the reality? I mean, no no government on earth is perfect. Here's an article from a publication called Socialist Worker in the UK, which I'm not sure exactly what their political line is, but they talk extensively about the nature and size of the protests and why they think they happened. So, they say in Havana there was a spontaneous march of at least 3,000 people chanting anti-government slogans, and there were protests in other places in Cuba. And there were clashes between pro-government and anti-government protesters, some of which descended into violence. And according to them, the origin and essence of the protests, they say most of the protesters were not linked to counter-revolutionary organizations, nor were the protests led by counter-revolutionary organizations, but there were lots of, there was definitely organizing by right-wing forces, both within Cuba and from the United States, with these protests. Let's just make that clear right up front before we get to that in this article. The political legitimacy of the government is considerably diminishing. Well, that may be true because Fidel Castro died a few years ago, and he was very popular in Cuba. He was the leader of the revolution. Diaz, the current president of Cuba doesn't have quite the same level of popularity, and primarily because of the embargo on Cuba, which Donald Trump considerably made worse. Cuba, as well as the pandemic last year, which basically killed Cuba's tourism industry, which is a major money maker for them. They're going through a lot of economic struggles right now. So there's discontent. The protests originated in working class neighborhoods with the greatest social problems. I'm not necessarily saying I agree or disagree with the claims in this article. I'm just telling you what they say. The protests did not represent a majority. Most of the Cuban population continues to support the government. So, as I said before, there were a few thousand people in Havana protesting against the government, but there were tens of thousands, estimates of around 100,000 in pro-government protests. In the protests, there were no socialist slogans. The slogans launched in the demonstrations focused on Patria y Vida, homeland and life, Libertad, freedom, abajo la dictadura, down with the dictatorship, attacks on President Miguel Diaz-Canel. Patria y Vida is a slogan drawn from an openly right-wing song popularized from Miami and by the right-wing opposition. So, remember what they said up here. Most of the protesters were not linked to counter-revolutionary organizations, nor were the protests led by counter-revolutionary organizations. But, in the protests there were no socialist slogans, and the slogans that they do talk about are largely right-wing slogans. That suggests, at the very least, that the right wing and forces that want to overthrow the Cuban government played a major role in the protests. The slogan "Down with the dictatorship" is frequently used by the Cuban right and counter-revolutionaries. Editorial board members of this publication spoke to protesters who were not against Fidel Castro or socialism and whose motivation was demanding better lives. However, this differentiation was not made explicit in the protests. Okay? That suggests, maybe there was a sizable right-wing element in the protests. Okay. Counter-revolutionary propaganda had a role in organizing the protests, and the demonstrations turned violent. Okay, so there's that context. The hypocrisy here is just off the charts. So, there's this big to-do about problems in Cuba, but meanwhile, we're allies with Saudi Arabia, who, unlike the Cuban government, they just behead protesters or put them in prison and torture them and so forth. In Israel, they just shoot protesters or bomb people who aren't even protesting. So just mass murder there. And we support Israel. We give them $3 or $4 billion a year in aid. I think it's $3.8 billion a year in military aid. And I don't think Israel's an apartheid state. It's a genocidal in the ethnic cleansing sense of the term state, and we're allies with them. Meanwhile, Cuba, which you might crack down on protesters sometimes, as happens here in the United States too, on a much worse scale actually, but they don't have anything like that. Primo Radical, a YouTube commentator, says, I've been to Cuba. I didn't see a single homeless person while I was there. I've also been to Brazil and seen people living inside of highway overpasses. I also live in Connecticut and have seen people begging for money in the middle of winter. And likely there are lots of homeless people visible on the streets in whatever town you live in. Here in the United States, if that's where you live. You don't find that in Cuba. You don't find that in a lot of places, even places like Cuba that are a lot poorer than the United States. Cuba also has outstanding universal health care, one of the lowest infant mortality rates in the world, and approximately the same life expectancy as the United States, despite they're having a fraction of the GDP of the United States. Free education all the way through grad school, so on and so forth. They just recently voted on a new constitution in Cuba in 2019, passed by an overwhelming margin. Boots Riley points out that it's just nonsense that they don't have elections in Cuba. And in fact, they have pretty free elections. As he says, there are multiple candidates for each particular office. And this election that he took pictures of, suffrage is universal for Cubans aged 16 years and older. So they don't do things like purge you from the voter rolls if you moved to somewhere else in your town, or if they think you might be black, or things like that happen here in the United States. Actually voting in elections in Cuba is mandatory, as it is in quite a few other Western countries, like I believe Australia, for example. And here they try to prevent you from voting. Let's see. What else was I going to talk about? Oh, yeah. Okay, so we've looked at the reactions from the Republican side of the aisle and the mainstream Democratic side of the aisle, Joe Biden. Let's look at what AOC had to say. And this tweet thread was deleted. That's why somebody had to take screenshots of it. But she posted something pretty similar to this shortly after that. We see Cubans rise up and protest for their rights like never before. Fist, Cuban flag. We stand in solidarity with them and condemn the undemocratic actions led by President Diaz-Canel. The suppression of the media, speech, and protests are serious violations of basic civil rights. We must also name the contribution of the United States to Cuban suffering, our embargo of almost 60 years. Okay, so, she makes the supposed undemocratic nature of the Cuban government front and center, but then she both sides it by saying the U.S. Embargo that's been in place throughout the history of the Cuban Revolution. She says almost 60 years, but it's actually since 1959, so more than that. But anyway, last month, once again, she says the UN voted overwhelmingly to ask the United States to lift its embargo on Cuba. The embargo is absurdly cruel, and like many other U.S. policies directed at Latin Americans, the cruelty is the point. I strongly reject the Biden administration's defense of the embargo. It is never acceptable for us to use cruelty as a leverage point against everyday people. Okay, so last couple of tweets are okay, but, again, she's, much as Bernie Sanders did with Venezuela, and I didn't see a statement on this, but I'm sure it's pretty much the same. She both sides it and repeats talking points about how undemocratic Cuba supposedly is, and then secondarily she talks about the embargo and its impact on Cuba, and likely it has a major role in causing the discontent that you do see in Cuba, but we won't hear about that from her. Look at this. Just a couple of days after the protests in Cuba, which were mostly responded to peacefully by the police. They did arrest some people, but nothing like what you see here in Los Angeles. Just out of the blue, peaceful protesters were attacked by a shit ton of cops wielding billy clubs. They also fired tear gas and rubber bullets at the crowd. They injured a number of people with their rubber bullets. And these protesters were not doing anything to cause this. The cops just started beating them out of the blue. And this happens all the time in the United States. So, I guess my point here is, there might be issues with the Cuban government. There are also very positive things about what the Cuban government has done. They are about the only third world global south country that I know of that's made their own vaccine. In fact, they have two of them, but due to the U.S. embargo, they're having trouble getting enough syringes to rapidly vaccinate their population as they were planning to. They send doctors around the world to provide medical care to people, and they've sent medical supplies around the world during COVID. And as I mentioned earlier, many gains for working people in Cuba as a result of the Cuban Revolution. Are there problems? Yes. Is it perfect? No. But fucking leave Cuba alone, folks. Let them handle their own problems. Okay, that's all for tonight. I will hopefully see you again soon.